Tonight, we enter a world on edge. The date is early 1945, and across continents and oceans the gears of war are grinding louder than ever. Cities lie in ruins, families torn apart, and armies exhausted but relentless. You trudge alongside weary soldiers on endless battlefields, hear the distant roar of bomber planes slicing through grey skies, and smell the bitter smoke of a world aflame. Somewhere deep in Washington, D.C., a secret decision looms, one that could reshape history in a blink or shatter it forever. It's a moment when science, politics, and human desperation swirl in uneasy harmony. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The Second World War is dragging into its final chapters, but no one knows quite how long those chapters will be, or how many pages will be torn away by bloodshed. Europe is on the brink of liberation, but the Pacific remains a fiery battleground where the Japanese hold stubbornly to islands that seem barely worth the price in lives to capture. From the icy tundras to tropical jungles, war stretches humanity's endurance to breaking point. You can almost feel the fatigue pressing down like a heavy blanket damp with sweat and sorrow. Amid this chaos, an invention from the minds of a few brilliant but conflicted scientists promises to end the nightmare or plunge the world into a new kind of darkness. You might have heard about it in passing: an atomic bomb capable of unleashing the power of 1,000,000 tons of TNT in a single instant. It sounds like science fiction, yet it's terrifyingly real. The question buzzing in the shadows is, should such a weapon ever be used, and if so, how soon? The story is tangled with secret labs, urgent telegrams, ethical puzzles, and political gambits. Some argue that the decision to use this bomb was necessary to save countless lives that a drawn-out war would claim. Others question whether the world was ready for such destruction, whether it opened a Pandora's box, better left closed. Historians still argue whether the use of the atomic bomb was a military imperative, a political message to the Soviets, or a tragic mistake driven by fear and haste. Tonight, as you sink into your blankets, let's journey back to those tense days. We'll walk through shadowed corridors of power, listen to the debates whispered in smoky rooms, and hover with the scientists whose calculations balanced on the edge of apocalypse. No rushed histories here, just a slow unfolding of a story too complex and too human to be told any other way. Remember the feeling of holding something fragile but powerful, like that moment when you first learned how to ride a bike, wobbling uncertainly but determined. The atomic bomb was that kind of moment for the world, terrifying, exhilarating, and full of unknown consequences. As we step forward, keep that feeling close. And don't worry, there will be a few light moments, because even amidst such gravity, humans find ways to surprise us. The Manhattan Project's secret birth is a story that starts in whispered urgency and unfolds into one of the most sprawling, secretive scientific undertakings the world has ever seen. Imagine sprawling desert landscapes turned into underground labyrinths of labs and factories, where the hum of machinery mingles with the excited chatter of physicists who sometimes seemed like mad geniuses tinkering on the edge of the impossible. You step inside these hidden places: the Los Alamos Laboratory, nestled in New Mexico's remote mountains; Oak Ridge's massive uranium enrichment plants, disguised as innocuous industrial sites; and Hanford's plutonium reactors, quietly boiling away under watchful eyes. None of it was spoken of aloud. To most Americans, the Manhattan Project was just a name, a ghost in the war effort. The project officially launched in 1942, fueled by a potent mix of scientific ambition and fear. Early on, some of the greatest minds of the era, Albert Einstein's famous letter to President Roosevelt. Notwithstanding the real push, came from a tight-knit group of physicists who worried Nazi Germany might be racing toward its own nuclear weapon. Picture Robert Oppenheimer, the project's brilliant but enigmatic scientific director, pacing anxiously through corridors lined with blackboards filled with equations that seemed to summon forces from another dimension. He famously mused on the paradox of wielding such power, knowing the bomb might end wars, but at a horrific cost. There were moments of oddity in the midst of this monumental effort. For example, the chemist Glenn Seaborg once joked about the absurdity of hauling around radioactive materials in makeshift containers like carrying hot potatoes that could burn your fingers and the whole planet. Or consider the project's security measures so tight that spies and double agents constantly loomed like shadows, forcing everyone to work in near-complete secrecy. One quirky fact is that despite the war's urgency, some scientists would sneak in casual games of tennis and chess during breaks, as if normality had to be fought for alongside physics. Of course, the project was not just about science. It was a political and military gamble. President Roosevelt was kept briefed, but remained physically distant from many details, leaving Vice President Truman largely in the dark until he took office. Historians still argue whether the scale and secrecy of the Manhattan Project were justified, or if the immense resources poured into it might have been better used elsewhere in the war effort. Some even suggest that the project's success was as much luck as genius, with discoveries accelerating faster than anyone expected. Yet by mid-1945, the bomb was no longer just theory. Tests had been run, most famously the Trinity test in July 1945, where a blinding explosion lit the New Mexico desert like a second sun rising. Scientists watched in awe and horror, knowing that this was a power humanity had never held before. And with that, the question shifted from, can we build it, to, should we use it, and how? Roosevelt's death and Truman's sudden burden changed everything in an instant. You can almost feel the shock ripple through the corridors of power on that April day in 1945, when the world's most powerful leader suddenly passed away. For Harry S. Truman, it was a staggering baptism by fire, one moment a senator, and then vice president who barely knew about the Manhattan Project. The next, the commander-in-chief, thrust into a world where the balance of peace and destruction hinged on his shoulders. Imagine waking up to that reality like being handed the keys to a car that's already speeding toward a cliff. Truman himself later confessed he was started out cold when the atomic bomb issue was laid before him, and he had to scramble to get up to speed on what was probably the most secretive and complex military project ever. The transition couldn't have been more sudden or stark. Roosevelt had shielded much of the bomb's development from public and even many government officials. Truman was briefed only after becoming president, introduced to Oppenheimer and the top scientists, and given the grim truth the United States had this terrifying new weapon, and its use might end the war quickly or reshape global power forever. Imagine Truman's first reactions, a mixture of awe, confusion, and a cold realization that decisions about life, death, and history now rested on his judgment. There's a well-known anecdote that he felt the weight of the world like a great black cloud, which is poetic, but probably accurate, given the stakes. Despite the monumental pressure, Truman was pragmatic. He understood the brutal logic of war and the desperate desire to end it before millions more soldiers and civilians died in a prolonged Pacific conflict. But he also faced ethical dilemmas that would haunt him. Was the bomb a means to save lives, or was it a show of power to intimidate the Soviet Union? Historians still argue whether Truman had the time or resources to fully explore alternatives, or whether the momentum behind the bomb's use was unstoppable by the time he arrived. Meanwhile, the world beyond the White House was changing fast. Germany surrendered in May 1945, but Japan showed no signs of giving up, determined to fight to the bitter end. You can picture Truman reading reports about fierce battles on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, with casualties mounting and American public patience fraying. Operation Downfall, the planned massive invasion of Japan, loomed on the horizon, promising weeks or months of bloody fighting that could cost millions of lives on both sides. The pressure on Truman wasn't just political, it was deeply personal and urgent. Still behind the scenes, a delicate balance of diplomacy and deception played out. Allies jockeyed for position in a post-war world where nuclear power would become a critical factor. Truman's sudden responsibility was not just about ending one war, but shaping the beginning of another one of influence ideology and the shadowy dance of the Cold War. And so, with heavy heart and steely resolve, Truman stepped into the unknown where every choice could ripple across decades. Remember that feeling of holding a new gadget you don't quite know how to use, but that could change everything? Truman's decision was just like that, dangerous, urgent, and utterly uncharted. As we move forward, keep that image close. It'll help make sense of the decisions that follow. Options on the table: invasion or atomic shock. Imagine sitting in a war room, maps strewn across the table, generals and advisors debating the grim realities ahead. The Pacific War is dragging on island by island, with American forces bleeding and the Japanese showing an almost supernatural will to fight to the death. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was scheduled for November 1945, and its scale was staggering. It wasn't just one landing, it was a two-part invasion: Operation Olympic targeting Kyushu in the south, and Operation Coronet aimed at the Tokyo plain months later. The casualty estimates were chilling, with military planners projecting hundreds of thousands of Allied deaths and possibly millions of Japanese casualties, including civilians. You can almost hear the exhausted sighs in that room, knowing this could become the bloodiest chapter of the entire war. Against this backdrop, the atomic bomb presented a radically different option. The idea was that a single devastating strike could shock Japan into surrender, avoiding the long, grueling invasion that would grind on for months. President Truman and his advisors wrestled with the possibilities. Could this weapon end the war quickly, or would it harden Japanese resolve? Some military leaders were skeptical, seeing the bomb as just another form of destruction, but nothing guaranteed to break the enemy's will. Others saw it as a necessary evil, a shortcut to peace that might spare countless lives. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Adding complexity was the fact that Japan had shown few signs of diplomatic willingness to surrender unconditionally. The fierce honor culture and militaristic ideology meant many leaders preferred death to capitulation, which only fueled fears that the invasion would be unimaginably costly. You can almost imagine the sleepless nights of advisors weighing the ethics of using a weapon so unlike anything before, an explosion so vast it could erase entire cities in seconds. There were alternative proposals on the table too: a demonstration of the bomb's power on an unpopulated island, a naval blockade to starve Japan into submission, or waiting for the Soviet Union to declare war and attack Japanese forces from the north. But time was slipping away, and the war's terrible momentum pressed forward. Truman's advisors worried about the political fallout if the Soviets gained influence in Asia by acting first, and they feared Japan might dig in even harder. Historians still argue whether the bomb's use was primarily a military necessity or a political tool aimed at the Soviets, or some mix of both. Some suggest that the desire to end the war quickly was genuine, while others point to the emerging Cold War tensions influencing the decision. The complexity and urgency made any choice a gamble with the fate of millions. The Potsdam Conference and shadowed diplomacy unfolded in the summer heat of July 1945, a meeting steeped in tension beneath the leafy German countryside, where the victors of Europe gathered to decide the fate of the world. You can almost feel the sticky air pressing on the delegates as they sat in grand, heavy chairs negotiating amidst cigars, whispered asides, and occasional outbursts. President Truman, freshly arrived and still grappling with the atomic bomb's potential, joined British Prime Minister Churchill, soon replaced by Clement Attlee after a surprising election, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, whose inscrutable gaze seemed to hide endless calculations. This gathering was about more than post-war Europe. It was where nuclear power quietly entered the diplomatic playbook. Truman, now fully briefed on the bomb, saw the conference as a chance to wield it not just as a weapon of war, but as a geopolitical signal. During secret discussions, he hinted at the new weapon of unusual destructive force, a veiled warning to Stalin that America had moved into a new realm of military might. Stalin, for his part, knew more than he let on, having been informed by Soviet spies about the Manhattan Project, but chose to keep his cards close to his chest. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and unspoken rivalries, like a poker game where no one wanted to reveal their hand first. Amid the formal declarations and agreements like the demand for Japan's unconditional surrender and the division of Germany into occupation zones, the atomic bomb hovered like a specter. The Allies aimed to present a united front, but beneath the surface fractures were widening. The bomb wasn't just a weapon, it was a bargaining chip in a rapidly emerging Cold War. One curious anecdote from the conference was Truman's reaction to the news that the bomb had been successfully tested back home. Reports say he kept the details close, sharing the information only with select advisors while occasionally cracking jokes to mask his nerves. Some historians argue his posture was partly to keep Stalin guessing. Others believe Truman himself was still absorbing the bomb's implications. Historians still debate how much the bomb's diplomatic role influenced its use. Was it primarily a tool to end the war or a way to intimidate the Soviets? The Potsdam Conference marked a turning point where warfare and diplomacy intertwined with unprecedented complexity, setting the stage for decades of nuclear brinkmanship. Hiroshima, chosen city of urgency and tragedy. When the time came to select the first target for the atomic bomb, the decision-makers faced a grim task. Like surgeons choosing the place to make a life-altering incision, only this was a wound that would scar for generations. Hiroshima, a bustling military hub and port city in southwestern Japan, was selected partly for its strategic importance, but also because it had largely escaped the firebombing raids that devastated other Japanese cities. This meant the bomb's impact could be clearly measured and its psychological shock maximized. You can almost hear the quiet, methodical discussions of the target committee as they debated which cities would best serve the grim purpose. Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki and Kyoto all made the list at various points, with Kyoto spared at the last minute due to its cultural significance, a fact that's led some to speculate on whether political or personal preferences swayed decisions. The committee also considered weather terrain and military value. Hiroshima's flat terrain would amplify the bomb's blast, making it a grimly perfect candidate. A quirky, lesser-known fact is that Hiroshima had a secret nickname among some American planners, Little Boy, which later became the code name of the bomb itself. The city was a quiet, vibrant place home to around 350,000 people, many going about their daily lives, unaware that history was about to descend upon them in a devastating flash. It was also a major command center for the Japanese Second Army, making it a legitimate military target in the eyes of the Allies. There was a bittersweet irony that Hiroshima, largely untouched by previous bombings, was about to become the world's first victim of nuclear warfare. Its residents, farmers, students and workers, carried on with a semblance of normalcy, little suspecting the cataclysm to come. Some scholars suggest that choosing Hiroshima was as much about sending a message as it was about military strategy, an experiment in terror that would shake Japan's resolve. Historians still argue whether the city's selection was purely strategic or influenced by other factors, including the desire to test the bomb's effects on an urban environment and to force a swift Japanese surrender. The reality, like much of this story, is layered with complexities and uncertainties. The pilot's flight and the bomb's release are moments frozen in time, almost surreal in their quiet tension before unleashing devastation. Picture the early morning of August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, a B-29 Superfortress bomber, named after the pilot Paul Tibbets's mother, lifts off from Tinian Island in the Pacific. The air is humid, and still the sky painted with soft pastels of dawn. You're inside that plane, feeling the vibrations through the metal floor, hearing the soft murmurs of the crew as they prepare for a mission unlike any other. There's a strange calm mixed with a tense anticipation, a quiet before a storm unlike anything war has ever seen. The bomb itself, codenamed Little Boy, is a bulky, unsettling package secured beneath the belly of the plane, ticking with a quiet menace. Tibbets and his crew are acutely aware of the gravity of their task, though they can't fully grasp the scale of the destruction their payload will deliver. They fly over the clouds, the vast Pacific beneath them, carrying the hopes and fears of millions. As they approach Hiroshima, the city lies sprawled peacefully below, unsuspecting. The plane ascends to the predetermined altitude, and at exactly 8:15 a.m., the bomb is released. For a brief, surreal moment, everything seems still. The bomb drops silently through the sky, its descent marked only by the crew's breath held tight. Then a blinding flash lights the horizon, a fireball blooming like a terrible flower in slow motion, followed by a mushroom cloud rising majestically into the sky. The shockwave ripples outward, flattening everything in its path. One quirky detail: the Enola Gay crew famously watched the blast from a distance, with some recalling that the explosion was so bright it temporarily blinded them. There's an eerie quiet after the initial roar, almost as if the world held its breath. The city below, once vibrant and full of life, is instantly transformed into a wasteland. The bomb's energy was equivalent to around 15,000 tons of TNT, releasing heat and radiation that would continue to wreak havoc for years. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and horrific, but the Enola Gay's crew had no way to foresee the full consequences. The human toll would soon become clear: tens of thousands dead instantly, and countless others suffering from burns, radiation sickness, and trauma. Yet amid the horror, some in the crew later remarked on the strange beauty of the mushroom cloud, an unsettling juxtaposition of awe and destruction. Historians still argue about whether the bomb's psychological impact justified the human cost, or whether alternative actions might have ended the war sooner without nuclear devastation. This moment, suspended between science and catastrophe, marked the dawn of the nuclear age. Aftermath debates, surrender shock, and moral questions flooded the days following Hiroshima's destruction like a storm that refused to settle. The Japanese leadership found itself caught in a terrible bind, proud warriors faced with an unthinkable new reality, while the civilians beneath them bore the brunt of the devastation. You can almost hear the desperate conversations in dimly lit rooms where some argued for surrender, others for continuing the fight, and many just hoped the horror was a nightmare. Emperor Hirohito's role became pivotal, eventually tipping the scales toward acceptance of defeat, but the path was anything but straightforward. Complicating matters, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan just days later, on August 8th, launching a massive invasion into Japanese-held territories in Manchuria. This two-pronged shock, nuclear and military, intensified the pressure. The Japanese military had hoped that the Soviets might mediate a peace, but Stalin's entry crushed that hope, accelerating Japan's decision to surrender. This timing has led to historians still arguing about which factor was more decisive, the atomic bombs or the Soviet declaration of war. Some say the bombings alone forced capitulation, others emphasize the Soviet invasion's strategic impact. The moral questions sparked fierce debates then and now. Was the scale of civilian casualties justifiable? Could a demonstration of the bomb's power on an unpopulated area have sufficed? Some survivors, known as hibakusha, have shared harrowing testimonies that bring a deeply human face to the statistics. These stories reveal not just physical suffering, but profound psychological scars that linger through generations. Amidst the horror, a curious fact emerges: the Japanese government delayed the public announcement of the bomb's full impact to maintain morale, while many Americans at home had only a vague idea of the bomb's effects, wrapped in a mix of pride and unease. The official surrender came on August 15, 1945, effectively ending World War II, but the debates about the bomb's necessity and ethics continue to ripple through scholarly circles and public consciousness alike. The second bomb and the dawn of the nuclear age unfolded with unsettling rapidity. Barely 3 days after Hiroshima on August 9, 1945, another B-29 bomber, the Boxcar, took off toward Nagasaki, carrying Fat Man, a more complex plutonium bomb. The rushed timeline was fueled by a mix of strategic urgency and a desire to maintain pressure on Japan to surrender unconditionally. Imagine the tension in the cockpit, the crew aware that their mission carried the weight of an entire world poised on the edge of peace or annihilation. Nagasaki, chosen somewhat reluctantly as the primary target, Kokura was obscured by clouds, was a bustling industrial city, home to shipyards and military factories. The city's geography, a series of valleys surrounded by hills, meant that the blast's effects were somewhat contained compared to Hiroshima, yet the destruction was still catastrophic. The bomb exploded with a force estimated at 21,000 tons of TNT, flattening much of the city and killing tens of thousands instantly, with many more succumbing to radiation and injuries later. The impact of the second bomb was immediate and profound. Japan announced its surrender shortly afterward, bringing an end to hostilities. But more than just ending a brutal war, these two bombings ushered in the nuclear age, an era where humanity held in its grasp the power to obliterate itself. This dawning reality reshaped global politics, alliances, and fears. One quirky detail involves the bomb's nickname Fat Man, which contrasted sharply with Hiroshima's Little Boy. While the names sound almost playful, they belied the devastating seriousness beneath. Some crew members joked about the odd monikers, a rare glimpse of levity amid the grim mission. Historians still debate whether dropping the second bomb was necessary given Japan's weakened state and the Soviet invasion. Some argue it was a show of force to the Soviets, signaling the new balance of power. Others believe it was a tragic continuation of the military imperative to end the war swiftly. Legacies whisper, reflections on power and peace stretch long beyond the final echoes of explosions and surrender. The atomic bomb's use marked a threshold where humanity's genius and its capacity for destruction became irrevocably intertwined. You can almost feel the slow, heavy exhale of a world grappling with the consequences, survivors walking amidst ruins, leaders confronting new responsibilities, and scientists haunted by what their discoveries unleashed. The mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are etched not only in history, but in collective memory, symbols of both ultimate devastation and cautious hope. The bomb's legacy is tangled in paradox. On one hand, it helped end a brutal war and arguably saved millions of lives that an extended conflict would have cost. On the other, it opened a Pandora's box of ethical dilemmas and ushered in an era defined by the fear of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War that followed saw nations locked in an uneasy standoff, the bomb's shadow looming over diplomatic halls and everyday life, from civil defense drills to cultural expressions of anxiety and resilience. A quirky tidbit, the phrase mutually assured destruction wasn't coined until later, but its chilling logic emerged directly from the atomic bomb's existence. It's the idea that the sheer destructive power held by opposing sides would prevent either from launching a first strike, a precarious peace maintained by fear. This paradox continues to shape global politics today. Historians still argue about the necessity and morality of using the bomb. Was it an unavoidable military decision or a political maneuver? Could diplomacy or alternatives have spared millions? These debates echo in academic halls and popular discourse, reminding us that history is rarely simple or settled. As you settle deeper into the calm of night, think of the atomic bomb's legacy as a whisper, an invitation to remember the past's lessons while fostering a future where such power is met with wisdom and restraint. The story isn't just about destruction, it's about humanity's enduring hope for peace. Tonight's story begins to slow, like the soft closing of a heavy book after a long day of reading. The images of mushroom clouds and quiet cities give way to a gentle stillness, a moment to breathe and reflect. You're wrapped in the calm hum of your room, the faint rustle of sheets, the distant sound of night settling in the slow rhythm of your own breath, syncing with the quiet. The past feels vast and weighty, but here and now it softens into a whisper of memory rather than a roar of destruction. The decision to use the atomic bomb was never simple. It carried the hopes of ending a horrific war swiftly and the burden of unleashing devastation beyond anything before. It reminds us how fragile and complex the human story is, where great power and great responsibility walk hand in hand, often in uneasy step. Yet even in the darkest moments, there is a spark of reflection, a hope that lessons learned from history guide us toward peace rather than repeat past mistakes. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the voices of those long-ago scientists, leaders, civilians, each carrying their own fears, hopes, and dreams. Their stories echo softly in the night, reminding us that history isn't just about dates and decisions, it's about people with all their courage and contradictions. So now let the quiet settle around you, the hum of the fan, or a soft night sound blending with your thoughts, drawing you gently toward rest. May this moment of calm carry you safely through the night, holding you in a peaceful embrace until morning light. Sweet dreams.